concept that is helpfully provided by Elizabeth Anderson in a paper that really should be known better, this situated knowledge and interplay of value judgments and evidence and scientific inquiry. A concept is thickly evaluative if its application is guided by empirical facts. It also licenses, however, normative inferences, and interests and values guide the extension of this concept. So well-being is like that. Obviously, you would like to think that there is a lot of empirical information guiding our ascriptions of well-being to individual communities, both in regular life when you kind of eyeball how your child is doing or how your friend is doing, and more formally by agencies and organizations. So, but that is a very common situation in social and environmental and biological sciences, where lots of other concepts are like that. So biodiversity, health, perhaps also kind of resilience and close-knittedness of communities, so many concepts that refer to some kind of desirable or undesirable property are thick in this way, and there are lots of facts guiding their application, but you also need to make a value judgment as to their content and scope. So what is responsible science when concepts are thick? Philosophers have so far haven't really answered this question. They, like me, they just like to emphasize that lots of concepts in sciences are thick. But what to do about that is a little bit less clear in our view. And in particular, though, because we think about well-being, we like to ground ourselves into how to deal with thickness of well-being, especially. So here are so far the claims of this project that we need help with. So the first thing we want to do is we want to distinguish between three different ways you might approach thick concepts, and that distinction, that breakdown into three different ways is itself something that I'm not sure about, and we really need a lot of feedback. So let me try and submit that these are kind of mutually exclusive and exhaustive options, and please let me know how it sounds. So the first option is to just redefine it as a technical term that loses its evaluative tinge. I'm going to use well-being as such, as life satisfaction, and then proceed. The second one is to not treat it as a technical term, but assume full responsibility when you're a scientist or a research team for making the value judgment. Well-being is life satisfaction. And the third way is to make this value judgment with political legitimacy. So we would like to develop this third option. We think it is preferable any time that a piece of social science is close to public policy and action, but it's really hard to get it right. And people have tried in several different ways, and we think that ours is the best. So our model is this attempt to co-produce measurements of phenomena picked out by thick concepts by balancing three sources of expertise. That's the way to give it political legitimacy. And that way, when you balance expertise that is lived, professional, and academic. And of course, the only way you can make sure that you balance it well is when you are focused very much on a very specific context of application that may or may not generalize. This is the theoretical model that we're putting forward, but we also have a bit of a kind of a case study or a proof of concept. And this is the work we've been doing with an admirable charity, national poverty charity called Turn to Us. And we've been working with them to develop a concept of thriving under financial hardship. So let me take us through the our theoretical model, and then Mark will illustrate the case study. So let me start with what would be wrong with taking the first two options with regard to thick concepts. So the first one, as I've mentioned already, you redefine it as a technical term, and it's an extremely familiar modus of operandi in sciences of well-being. As I already said, it's a very common thing to say, well, for purposes of this project, I define well-being as life satisfaction, and you carry on. And in philosophy, the story that justifies this approach, I think, is given by Ernst Nagel in this little known piece in his Structure of Scientific Theories. That's when he discusses the possibility of having making value judgments, but actually without endorsing it. So that's how you could do a responsible job without with thick concepts, but without actually endorsing any particular value judgment, says Nagel. So this is a very attractive mode, actually, to work for the scientists, because, well, just think about concept postulation of technical terms that you then go ahead and work with is the name of the game, some of us would said in history and philosophy of science, and it's an extremely common mode, right? And here is where this argument comes in that Nancy has used in some of her writings, and that we are also wanting to make from Max Weber, that you do not have full freedom to postulate technical terms if you have a responsibility that he thinks a social scientist has. We think it's not just social scientists who have this responsibility, it's across the board responsibility to investigate to investigate significant phenomena of significance to perhaps the communities that make your work possible. So this is why the use of technical terms is it's a good mode. It has served science well, but there is a limit to its justifiability. Another really common mode is to say, I, the economist, or I, the psychologist, am going to make that value judgment, and I'm going to tell you that well-being is objective happiness or life satisfaction or some set of capabilities, right? So that's another very common mode. Both of these are, probably account for most of the sciences of well-being. It is a faster, simpler, it's more convenient. It's actually a more honest approach, because at least you're not denying that a value judgment is necessary, and it ensures independence of your research. But the problem is that it monopolizes the expertise about all things evaluative, when this expertise is in fact distributed among different people and different stakeholders, as we shall show. So we think that basically the first strategy and the second strategy are sometimes defensible. I think it would be wrong to make a very blanket claim about that you should never do one or the other. I think they are acceptable in certain contexts, in contexts when you're interest is largely theoretical, or perhaps a context in which you are in a great hurry and you need to produce a piece of science, and you are fairly confident about making the value judgment, or perhaps in one in which the empirical results you produce don't really it doesn't really make a difference which value judgment you make. They will be the same. They might be robust, but nevertheless, we think that there are downsides to both of these, and the third option does need to be considered and researched. So what's that third option? Well, the third option is to recognize that you're in a political territory when you make this value judgment, and the value judgments have to be legitimate in a certain way. In what way exactly? So we think that colleagues have tried implementing something like this third option in different ways. So some of our colleagues go by what we call by the letter of the idea of legitimacy. So they design surveys that let people and, well, the stakeholders of their research make the value judgments via their self-reports. So many people justified life satisfaction questionnaires exactly with this democratic argument. They say that by asking people how satisfied are you with your life as a whole, you pass on to them the judgment about what are the valuable things in your life and how do they aggregate. So many of our colleagues in economics and in psychology make this democratic justification of life satisfaction. And even those who don't go for life satisfaction, like colleagues in ethics and political theory, Dan Hebron and Valerie Tiberius, I'm thinking, like to make this argument that when it comes to public policy, measures that you use of well-being have to be subjective in that they capture the values. They let people define what well-being means for them. This is good. This is, well, it is at least an attempt to give a justification for legitimacy of your measures. But we think it's not very much in the spirit of legitimacy. And that is because there isn't really a genuine consultation and conversation with your stakeholders, that those are the surveys that capture well their judgments of their value judgments, be they about well-being or health or anything else. So, and in particular, they're also not consulted about the fact that their well-being is going to be measured on 10-point scale, like with life satisfaction. So there isn't really here a genuine conversation. There is rather kind of an outsourcing of the value judgment to the stakeholders, which, again, sometimes justifiable, but we want to do better. So to go for legitimacy in the spirit rather than in the letter, what we are exploring is, the desire to reflect values of your stakeholders by including those stakeholders in the production of the concept and then also the measure. And once again, there are different ways of doing that kind of inclusion. There are large-scale citizen consultations that several national statistical bodies conduct, like the Office of National Statistics, or many other European countries have had such a kind of, what matters to us as British citizens? Let's decide what we're going to do, what we're going to put in our set of indicators that are going to represent good life in Germany, or that I'm speaking about Good Lebens in Deutschland initiative. or Nouvel Indicateur de Richesse in France have also been kind of tested with these sort of big consultations. And once again, Mark and I think that this is a good thing, these consultations, but they also have big downsides. They return these fantastically wide, sometimes trivial, sometimes not very informative claims about what things matter, that conflict with each other, that money matters or money doesn't matter, and so there are lots of reasons to worry about the fact that there isn't a genuine kind of thought and deliberation that goes into that happens through consultations. So what we want to do is we want to learn from experiences of colleagues all over the world of public policy and health policy and charity work that conduct co-production exercises with their stakeholders, but we want to figure out what would be a co-production exercise when it applies to thick concepts that in particular we want to be measurable. So it is this final option that Mark and I are exploring. So here is the model that our definition of co-production. Co-production, as we use the term, which is not the same as STS people use the term, like Jasanoff and Latour, and it's not the same as the public policy people who use the term when they talk about co-production of services. Co-production for us is an arrangement for sharing power and responsibility among stakeholders in the process of defining a thick concept and in the process of developing the measures. And this arrangement requires first recognizing different sources of expertise that each group of stakeholders have about these concepts, and then ensuring that the final product that you develop meets, to the extent that it is possible, requirements stemming from each source of expertise. So, and to give you a little bit more thoughts about what expertise should go into it, let us distinguish between members of the public, service providers, and academics. I mean, it's a very rough distinction, as you can imagine. It's just a good starting point. In the well-being policy, there is always like the public that you're trying to serve, who is doing the serving and who is informing the serving. That's the academics. So that's the division makes sense for us. So the distinctive expertise that these three different groups enter is lived expertise, what we might call professional expertise. How do you actually deliver the services? How do you actually deliver the measurement? And of course, expertise about theories underlying measurements. So they would be theories of well-being, metrology, psychometrics, and things like that. So that's academics. So if you now take this model and apply it to measurement, which we know from Nancy and Jonathan Fuller and Norman Bradburn from a paper that we know and love. Measurement has three stages: characterization, representation, and procedures, right? You first define the concept, identify its boundaries, fix what belongs to it and what doesn't. Then you define the metrical system that appropriately represents the quantity of the concept, and then you formulate rules for applying the metrical system to tokens to produce the measurement results. So that would be the procedures. So now, look, we're wanting to map on these stages of measurement onto our model of co-production. So if we have these three different groups of stakeholders, members of the public, academics, and service providers, who have their distinctive expertise, lived, scholarly, and professional, their distinctive input, at least, to start with, is going to be into characterization, into representation, and into procedures. And this is not to say that academics won't have views about characterization. Oh God, they do, very, very strongly. And of course, members of the public will have plenty of views about procedures, because they are on the receiving end of these questionnaires, and so on and so forth. So the point of the co-production exercise is that we start with this kind of laying out each other's distinctive uh, spheres of knowledge, and then we try to produce a measure that marries, that kind of trades off if necessary, but kind of satisfies to the extent that it is possible all three of those characteristics. Characterization, representation, and procedures. So whatever measure emerges out of such a power sharing and responsibility sharing and therefore credit sharing arrangement is a good measure. So that's the theory. But now, can that really work in practice? So this is, I'm turning over to Mark, who will tell us about the fact that this is not just a model. We are trying it out. It is possible. We have a proof of concept, so to speak. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Anna. So as Anna mentioned, we've been working with this charity, Turn to Us, which is a digital charity and national in the UK. They have quite a few aspects to their work on which wellbeing has some bearing, but two that I'd kind of particularly like to flag are that they have this tool called a benefits calculator, which is kind of a web platform that you can log on to, enter all your welfare and benefits relevant details, like your income, how many kids you have, the value of your assets, that sort of thing. And it will tell you what benefits you are eligible for, and then also take you through to the government's website and even pre-fill some of the material on the government's website. And the idea is to try to help people get access to these kind of payments and make it really easy for them from a behavioral point of view. And the second thing that they do is provide grants to people, and quite large grants of upwards of £1,000, but typically only one-off. And those are specifically for people who have some kind of professional background that's based on the original donor who set up the trust that the money is drawn from, and who've had a life-changing event that has put them into a situation where they face financial hardship. So often it's sudden illness, sudden deaths, these kind of things. Very importantly for us, co-production is already quite well integrated into Turn to Us's operations. So pretty much any kind of policy reform that they make to their operation, they try to co-produce with people who have at least lived expertise of the kind of situations that Turn to Us work with, if not direct lived expertise of being in those situations and coming to Turn to Us for help. So that's made things a lot easier for us because we've been able to, in a sense, kind of outsource a lot of the kind of learning process to their existing experience. Next slide, please. So basically, as Anna said, we've got these three groups. We've got the lived experts. We're really trying to center their value judgments and center their kind of perspective on well-being or thriving in this case. Then we have the professional experts from Turn to Us who are bringing the charity's perspective in terms of what its work involves, what the kind of practical requirements are, both of the theory that comes out and of the measurement. And then we have Anna and I and a third colleague, Yamini, who's been helping especially with the qualitative side of the research. And we're bringing these kind of more formal knowledge of theories of well-being and of measurement. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll just go through this quite quickly. This is the sort of process we're following, and we've just about wrapped up stage 2. So we began with an online surveys. The benefits calculator is quite useful because in order to use it, everyone has to input their emails, and then you can ask them, do you mind if we contact us for a survey later? And a lot of people say yes, and so we can reach about 5,000 people who have interacted with the charity in the past to ask them various questions. And we sent out a very short survey, 5 questions, mostly sort of ranking questions, like please rank the following 5 domains in terms of their relevance to your well-being: financial satisfaction, life satisfaction, family satisfaction, community, job, this kind of thing, or the ONS4, which one of these resonates the most with you from a well-being point of view? Is it life satisfaction, meaning and purpose, feeling good, or anxiety? Things like that. And the idea with that short survey was just to give us a kind of initial steer in terms of what well-being might mean, and making sure that we don't kind of go off on completely the wrong paddock. And then we have this working group process where we had 4 lived experts, the 3 academic experts, and about 5 people from Turn to Us. And we met in a series of one-on-one conversations with each other, and then in small group conversations as well, from group to group, and developed over the course of about 2 months a theory of well-being, or a theory of thriving, and some initial thoughts about measurement. But one of the main things that came out was that we really needed to engage a lot more with the executive side of the charity to figure out which measurement aspects we'd go forward on. In the next stage now, once the charity has decided how it's going to use what's been produced so far, we're going to have a workshop where we bring in another 12 lived experts to try to get a little bit more representativeness to what we're doing. In that workshop, we're going to have a 1-day deliberation between the people who are in the working group and the new 12 lived experts to see whether there's any kind of refinements that we can make to the initial proposed theory and measures, whether they have any concerns about what the charity is going to do with it, that sort of thing. And on that basis, we will hopefully produce a final proposal, and we'll take that again to an online survey of about 1,500 people to try to get kind of endorsement from them. And so I think in this way, we're able to some extent, balance the need for a kind of rich qualitative engagement with what thriving means to people, and how the charity can possibly use it, with kind of a more quantitative or positivist approach to representativeness of what we come up with. In terms of the stakeholders that we got, the lived experts, the main inclusion criteria are that they are the sort of people that Turn to Us works with. So they need to have a professional background, but have experience of financial hardship and life-changing events. They had to be able to participate in the process, which was quite a weird sort of couple of hours a week thing for 2 months. So not the easiest thing to get people for. And then we wanted some kind of demographic distribution if possible. Next slide, please. And so these are the 4 lived experts. I'll just give you a very brief introduction to them. So we had Jay, who was a very successful sales executive, but he had some unresolved childhood trauma and a real uninvestigated sense of meaninglessness about his life. And he used alcohol to manage these feelings for a long time, but eventually that caught up with him and he got into a lot of debt, ended up in rehab and a homeless shelter. And then he actually discovered in a homeless shelter that he had a real passion for acting, painting, and other forms of artistry. And it was only when he really started to spend way more time on that he really started to thrive. Then we have T, who is a social worker. She was also a primary carer for a disabled mother with dementia. She had personal experience of domestic violence, and she also has mixed race children. So she had a lot of interesting thoughts on racism in the UK today. G is also a social worker of Nigerian heritage. She escaped domestic violence, but then ended up in financial hardship as a result, and had a lot of really interesting things to say about navigating the benefit system. And then we have R, who's a paraplegic, very interesting chap, Oxford educated, very explicit that he has limited experience with financial hardship, but he's been a long time disability rights advocate and has really extensive experience with the welfare system. So this is just a picture of our first Zoom call together, just to give you a sense for what the group was like. And it was actually really quite straightforward to do it all over Zoom. We thought it would be a lot harder than it was, but it actually went pretty well. We'll see how the workshop goes. So there's obviously a lot of demographics and things like that missing from the working group, and we will try to bring them in the workshop. But I think getting kind of perfect representativeness is not going to be feasible. We collected a very large amount of qualitative data on the basis of the working group interviews. And then I won't go into this in too much detail, but the analysis that we applied to that is essentially to start with grounded theory, which means that we kind of code line by line almost the text for what is literally being said. And then I, coming to this project with a lot of well-being baggage in terms of what the various theories are and which one of them I think are most reasonable, took an inductive approach to that data afterwards. So once we had that descriptive coding, then I applied various existing theories to it to try to make sense of it. Meanwhile, Yamini, our colleague, has no background in wellbeing theory, but does have a background in qualitative research. So she implied a more inductive approach where you try to let the data speak for itself as much as possible and see what themes emerge. Very interestingly, I think that the initial descriptive codes were almost identical. We had the same kind of top 15 items, but then after that, we got some divergence. Now, some of the key themes that come out are things that academics are quite familiar with. I think we were quite pleased to see actually that most of the themes were recognizable. So we saw a very strong emphasis on freedom and autonomy, on basic needs, overcoming cultural expectations and trying to find your kind of authentic values, self-knowledge, self-expression, this sort of stuff. And then also interpersonal relationships were the number one theme in the data. Some things, though, that were quite unique to the context that I have certainly not seen in a lot of academic work, at least in the kind of high theory space. So in particular, that the ability to access the welfare system and to have advocates and people who can help and support you with that process was a very strong theme in the research. Avoiding marginalization and oppression was an extremely strong theme. And then there was also, strikingly for us, much more of an emphasis on finding purpose in life rather than your life being pleasant. There was almost no mention of happiness and very little mention of pleasure in general. So how do we make sense of this? I'll just give you a very brief sketch of the sort of theory that's come out. So one of the strong themes, to put it the way a lot of the lived experts put it, is just that you can't thrive unless you have material means. So they're thinking in particular about health, housing, mental health, some income, disposable income, that sort of thing. But that thriving is more than material. So we kind of talk first about needing the means to thrive. Then you go through a process by which you learn how to leverage the means that you have in order to live the kind of life that you want, but also that suits you. That's something that you have to learn, not just what you want, but whether those desires suit you. And then we have these various outcomes that we think, or that the lived experts seem to suggest are indicative that you're thriving. So we think of the first block as capabilities. Now, capabilities theorists get a bit annoyed because means, they often think of capabilities as ends and that resources are means. Excuse me. Whereas we are thinking of capabilities broadly. Oh, what an awkward time to not have a glass of water. Anyway, so we're thinking of capabilities broadly as the options available to you. And then you need to have a lot of options. Then even once you've got the options, like in James's case, he had all the money, he had all the opportunities available to him to do whatever he wanted essentially with his life, but he didn't know what he wanted to do. He didn't know that he wanted to do art and painting and community leadership. And it was only when he became exposed to that and started to experiment with it and learn about what his authentic desires would be that he actually got started on thriving. And then once he got better at painting and better at acting and plugged into that whole community, then he started to get these things that we call the outcomes, things like a sense of autonomy, being self-directed and volitional in his life, feelings of competence, feelings of good relationships with people whose relations he values, and also then a sense of purpose. Next slide, please. So I basically just explained that there. Okay, so we'll just skip ahead. All right, so just on the measurement briefly, as I said earlier, this is kind of still work in progress for us, but while the academic theories of wellbeing have done quite well in this project, we feel that the measurement options that have been developed by academic and other sort of expert groups have done really badly. So we found that most of the sort of off-the-shelf options for measurement that the charity could use in its work to assess thriving just aren't going to fit the charity's practical requirements. So in particular, they are very adamant that they don't want to put up a lot of questions to someone who's coming to them for help. People are in distress, people are stressed, people need help urgently, and any kind of large chunk of questions to be like, could you just inform us over these 15 questions as to your thriving now so that we can come back to you in 3 months and reassess your thriving, is seen as a real turn-off to those people and something that's going to prevent them from seeking the help that they need and that the charity wants to give them. So this basically rules out almost all psychometric surveys from, say, self-determination theory and things like that, and also almost all existing capabilities and quality of life measures, because those surveys tend to have at least 12 questions. Some of the other quant questions that are shorter, like life satisfaction scales, have explicitly failed for reasons that are well established, like adaptive preferences in the interviews. So some, like Jay said that, when he was riding high but deeply depressed and had unresolved trauma, he would have said that his life satisfaction was an 8. And nowadays he would also say that it's an 8, but he thinks that his life now is vastly more preferable to how his life was back then. The other thing is that we've gotten explicit reports from the charity that they've tried to implement life satisfaction scales and they just don't find that they're sensitive. So people come to them in distress, give them a number, they get help, they say that they're less distressed, and they still report the same life satisfaction. So that doesn't seem to be sensitive to the actions that the charity is taking. Another point that's kind of worth making is that different aspects of the charity require slightly different things from measures. So the campaigns team, who's sort of trying to lobby politicians and gee up public interest in various reforms to the welfare system, really wants mostly quant. They think that's what cuts through, but they want a sprinkle of qualitative data to kind of give the human element to what they're proposing. Meanwhile, the caseworkers, for example, want almost the complete opposite. So they're like, quant doesn't really tell me anything about the kind of reality of the experiences that this person's having. I need some qualitative information. So what we're doing now is that we're working with the charity quite closely to try to figure out how they might use the theory that's been developed, what measures might be appropriate for those particular uses. We'll then check back with the lived experts and the working group more broadly as to whether they endorse all of that or they have various comments on it, and then we'll sort of proceed from there. Next slide, please. So I think this is my last slide before I hand back to Anna to conclude, which is just that one question we get often on this work is, well, how are you going to scale this up? How are you going to generalize it? This is it's a big charity, but it's one charity in a relatively large space, and there's so much more going on in wellbeing policy. So basically, I'm actually quite optimistic about this. I just think this would be a very long and time-consuming process. Might take a few decades, sort of thing. But basically, the idea would be, in public policy at least, that you would repeat this co-production process at different nodes of public policy. So we are working with an anti-poverty charity. We could also work with a charity that works on housing, works on debt, works on substance abuse. And then equally, way over somewhere else, you could have this co-production going on with people doing biodiversity and infrastructure and whatever it might be. And then looking around these nodes and seeing that there are other nearby nodes, you can get all those nodes together for a further round of co-production at a higher scale of public policy and try to abstract out a theory of well-being. So if you got the poverty, substance abuse, housing, and debt charities together, they might all find that there are a lot of similarities between the theories of thriving that they came up with at their individual nodes, and that a relatively coherent theory of thriving that applies more or less to all of them could be extracted from there. And then you could do that again as you move up the chain to sort of get a theory that might apply for all of social policy. And as you move higher up, you're inevitably generalizing and getting a slightly more abstracted, slightly vaguer concept. But in this way, we think you can get bottom-up development of these kind of statistics rather than top-down. And I think now I hand back to Anna.
Yes, thank you so much for your patience with us. This is it. We just want help with, we have a model of legitimacy for thick concepts and their measures, and that model is co-production involving 3 types of expertise committed to sharing power and responsibility. And we have a case study about how co-production of thriving yields, as Mark described, a really distinctive concept by comparison to other familiar well-being measures. So we are equally excited about both, but we need advice about who our audiences are and how we should package that ideas for the greatest impact. Much appreciated. I'm done. Thank you.